Welcome, everyone. Today, we're tackling a really interesting topic, but it's a tricky one. How in the world do you actually measure someone's listening ability?
And that's the big question, right? I mean, listening happens inside your head. It's totally invisible. You can't see someone listening. You can only see the result, what they do after they've listened. So let's dive into how language experts have figured out how to get around this.
So, here's what we've got on tap. We're going to look at the four main types of listening, break down the micro and macro skills that make it all work, and then check out the actual tasks used to test them.
All right, first things first. You have to know that not all listening is created equal. When it comes to assessment, experts break it all down into four main categories, and each one has a totally different goal. Okay, so here they are: intensive, responsive, selective, and extensive. A good way to think about this is like a spectrum, you know? On one end, you're focusing on the teeniest, tiniest details of sound, and on the other, you're grasping the big picture of a whole conversation.
Let's start with intensive listening, or nye-chun-so. This is really the ground floor. It's all about catching those fundamental building blocks of language, things like specific sounds, single words, and the rise and fall of someone's voice, their intonation.
Next up is responsive listening. Nghe đáp ứng. This one's pretty straightforward. It's all about a quick, direct reaction. You hear a question, you give a short answer. You hear a command, you respond. It's that simple back and forth that makes a conversation flow.
Then we've got selective listening, or nghe chọn lọc. And this is a skill you probably use every day. It's basically like hitting Control F in your brain. You're not trying to understand every single word someone says, you're just scanning the audio for specific bits of information, like a name, a date, or a number.
And last but not least, there's extensive listening. nghe mozok. This is where you zoom out and focus on the big picture. Think about listening to a long lecture or a story. Your main goal isn't to catch every detail, but to get the main idea, the overall gist of what's being said. Okay, so that covers the four main types. Now let's get into the weeds a bit and look at the nuts and bolts of how comprehension actually happens. We're talking about micro and macro skills.
So listening skills are generally broken into two camps. First, you have micro skills, or vikinang. These are what we call bottom-up skills, focusing on the little things, like individual sounds and grammar rules. Then you have macro skills, vikinang, which are top-down. This is where you use your general knowledge of the world to figure out the overall message. You absolutely need both. Think of it this way. Micro skills give you the puzzle pieces, and macro skills help you see the final picture.
And wow, look at the range here. This really shows you everything that's going on inside your head when you listen. It goes from something super basic, like telling the difference between the sounds in ship and sheep, all the way up to really complex stuff, like figuring out what someone really means, or guessing a word you don't know from context. It's the huge difference between just hearing sounds and actually truly understanding someone. All right, so we know the different types of listening and the skills involved. The big question now is, how do you test for them? Let's begin with tasks for intensive listening, the ones that are all about zooming in on those tiny details. A really common way to do this is with something called minimal pairs. It's a classic task. The test taker will hear one word, say bit, and then they have to choose between two written words that sound almost identical, like bit and bet. This is a super direct way to test that micro skill of hearing the tiny differences between sounds.
Another great example is paraphrase recognition. For this one, a student listens to a complete sentence. Then, they have to look at a few options and pick the written sentence that has the exact same meaning. So you can see we're moving up a level here, from just hearing sounds to actually understanding meaning at the sentence level.
Okay, let's pull back and look at the bigger picture again. Now we're going to check out tasks that test a wider range of skills, the ones that fall into those responsive, selective, and extensive categories we talked about. When it comes to responsive listening, you can't go wrong with a simple question and answer format. It's perfect. The student hears a direct question like, "How was your weekend?" And they have to give a short, appropriate answer, either by speaking or writing. It proves they didn't just hear noise. They actually understood what was being asked.
Okay, now for selective listening. A fantastic and really effective task type is called information transfer. And if you're studying for a test like the IELTS, you'll see this all the time. The idea is you listen to some information, maybe a description or a set of directions, and then you have to do something with it. You might have to label a map, fill out a form, or complete a diagram. You're transferring what you hear into an action.
And finally, for extensive listening, we come to a true classic, dictation. And, it's a classic for a good reason. A short passage, maybe 50 to 100 words, is read out loud, and the person taking the test has to write it down, word for word. It's such a powerful way to check if someone can comprehend, remember, and then write down longer chunks of language. So, let's wrap this up. The key takeaway is really this. You can't see listening. It's an invisible skill. So the only way to measure it is through an observable response, something you can see or read. And by breaking listening down into those 4 types and all those different micro and macro skills, test designers can create very specific tasks that give us a really clear picture of how well a person can truly understand what they hear. This video is brought to you by the IELTS Focus Zalo 08477059973, an English center specializing in IELTS preparation.